Story 1. I'm a teacher, and my whole class shares an imaginary friend. It'd be wrong to say I don't like kids. It's adults I have more of a problem with. In my last school, when I called one of the 10-year-old boys in my class a little bastard, he wasn't the problem. His parents were the ones who insisted I get fired. But that boy didn't mind me swearing at him because he knew damn well he'd keyed my car, even if I had no proof. He just thought it was funny, no different to the sort of interaction he'd have with an older sibling. On that note, I wouldn't say I like children either. Kids are little adults. They're more truthful, but only because the stakes are lower. People with jobs and mortgages tell great big tremendous lies. Kids don't have the weight of the world on their shoulders, so why lie about mistresses and promotions, and why you've been crushing up antibiotics into your wife's morning smoothie? Instead, they just lie about where their homework is. Kids I teach are right on the cusp of it. Some of the boys might get caught sniggering at the back while showing each other naughty little videos they don't understand but can't look away from, but then they go out and chase each other around. Do cartwheels. Play tag. Hide and seek. Cry if they take a particularly bad knock. Kids are weird. Got one whose dad's in jail, and he talks about it like it means nothing. His old man tried to kick a woman to death in the parking lot of a bar and won't be out until the boy's a teenager. Kid don't care. Doesn't get it. If anything, he thinks it's funny. But then last week I confiscated his novelty pencil that was the size of a cucumber, and he screamed so hard he threw up all over the speckled tiles that have been glued to this floor since '96. 10 is a weird age. Old enough to feel the vaguest hint of life's problems just beneath the surface like lumps in a pillow, to question why mommy downs 3 bottles of wine on a Tuesday, or why daddy changes his shirt and hides it in the garage before coming in from work, but too young to know what's really under the surface. These kids can feel something is wrong with the world. They just don't know what. Not yet, anyway. They have my sympathy. 26 years teaching has eroded most of everything else. I'm not particularly invested in whether these little shits become scientists or janitors. Nor am I particularly interested in helping them process their emotional luggage. If any of you want me to undo the damage you've done to your own kids, then you can start by paying me a hell of a lot more. But I do feel sorry for them because they don't really know what's going on, but unlike a 5-year-old, they can't just fumble around in blind ignorance. They're stuck in between worlds, one where you cry yourself to sleep at night over your parents' divorce but still think Santa and the Tooth Fairy are real. Maybe it's different at a rich school, one where kids don't go to food banks or where whole families don't have to share a smartphone. I doubt it. Don't know why. I just doubt anyone's out there living the plot of the Berenstain Bears, rich or otherwise. I used to dream of teaching at one of the big schools a couple towns over, the ones with all the funding. Oh, that'd be nice. Walking into a building that doesn't look like set dressing for the next season of True Detective. Now I just dream of getting out of this profession entirely. Maybe if I play my cards right. Sounds crazy to say it out loud, so I won't. But maybe I found a way out. Well, to be exact, the kids found it. Don't know what they got. Course they fucking don't. They're kids. They haven't got a clue. But I think I'm maybe 13 weeks from another go, and when that happens, you can bet your ass I'm asking for a ticket out of here. At first I plan on getting a cushy job in one of the schools a few towns over. One where the school bus doesn't have to plan its route around multiple trailer parks. Now I realize I was thinking small. If I'm smart, I won't ever have to work another day in my life. Imagine that? 13 more weeks. Right now Grenwig is with Layla. Sweet girl, but she's smart enough for it to be a problem. The dumb ones fare the best. You wake up to something grinning at your bedroom window. It helps to have the sort of mind that doesn't ask questions about what floor you're living on. Layla isn't winning a genius grant anytime soon, but I can tell it's bothering her because deep down she knows how wrong this all is. Dark circles under the eyes. Pallid skin. Eyes that keep darting to dark corners. Sometimes she falls asleep at her desk. Sometimes she wakes up with a little jump, like something only she can see has startled her. It's hard. Only reason she sticks it out is the same reason you or I would, the rewards. She got a smartphone last time. I wonder what it'll be this time. These kids don't ask for a lot. Toys, mainly. One of them got crazy good at football crazy quick. That makes sense. But it's that kind of thing, you know? They don't ask after the lottery or nothing like that because money's a little too abstract right now. Strange thing though, as young and naive as they are, they learn the rules pretty quickly. I guess Grenwig's lessons aren't subtle. Just look at one of my former students, Jared. Now at the time all this flew under my radar. Kid in my class lost a parent, moved away. So what? Happens. Turns out he asked for his father to get sober. Next day the poor guy got caught in the machinery at his job. CCTV footage was very popular on live leaks. Makes for grim viewing. I'm not particularly handy, so I never knew a lathe could do that to a human body. Anyway, it's not good to ask after other people. I wish my dad was this. I wish mom was that. Oof. Alia told me that up front around the time I started asking why half the kids in my class had new iPhones and Nintendo Switches. She said it was easy to ask for things, but it was riskier to ask to change something into another thing, and downright awful to ask it to change a person in any way, no matter how small. Even that kid who got good at football played a risky game. It paid off, but the other kids wouldn't go near him for a week. They kept expecting something bad to happen to him, and they didn't want to be in the splash zone. I can't pretend to understand the subtleties. Like the kids, I can only observe what happens to other people and learn the lessons that imparts. Nothing about Grenwig is guaranteed. There are no certainties. Even the kids get worn down by it. Whoever has it, they're a pariah. Risk assessment in under 11s. Strange thing to see. But unless it's your turn, you don't even want to risk something as inane as a game of catch with his chosen friend. Grenwig is territorial. Possessive. Bizarre. Didn't even believe in it until it was somehow my turn, which the kids found pretty alarming. Grenwig doesn't like adults. I thought it was a ghost at first. Lights coming on and off. Footsteps in the corridor outside my apartment. Pretty creepy, sharing my home with something I couldn't see. I didn't like it, but it had only been a couple of nights, and I did a good job of convincing myself there was no ghost or poltergeist. Just an overactive imagination. Yeah, sure, the TV channel changed and there were finger marks on my bathroom window I hadn't put there. So what? Way at the back of my mind I'd reserved a little bit of space for the possibility of a haunting, but otherwise I remained a skeptic. Jesus, if only it was as simple as a haunting. I don't know if I could explain to you how it felt that first time I woke to Grenwig gently stroking my toes. Jesus. The violation of it. The feeling of a world that didn't make sense. My eyes glared at his fingers, terrified, heart pounding, head throbbing like I'd taken a knock, and I kept waiting for it to make sense. My eyes wandered, tried to find the hands those fingers belonged to, but they just kept going. And going. And going. They stretched for meters until they disappeared into the shadow of my closet. Whole time they kept massaging the big toes. Cold as ice. I started counting the knuckles. Got to 13 and gave up. But they were fingers. I could tell from the nails. The hair that ran along dimpled skin the color of cement. And then just as I started to really appreciate that I was awake, 100% stone cold sober and lucid, and what I was seeing wasn't a dream or a nightmare or some other fucking conjuration of the mind, just as I felt panic begin to flare up inside my chest like a burgeoning heart attack, those impossible long fingers withdrew into the darkness like a spider curling its legs. I got up and threw on the lights, but found my closet empty. Felt like the world was coming apart. Had to be a night terror, I decided. Hadn't had one for decades, but what else could it be? I wanted to go back to sleep, to at least try, but I was so scared I couldn't face the dark again, so I decided to stay up. Went out into the living room and turned the TV on, plopped down onto the sofa, and let my head tilt back. I might have drifted off again. I don't know for sure. All I remember was the feeling as the cushion beneath me adjusted and I heard it. The sound of something tightening, like a creaking door. I looked down and saw white bands wrapped around the entirety of the sofa. Fingers. They tightened, and the material let out a groan as the tension went up a notch. I flew upwards in a terrible panic. By the time I turned back, the fingers were gone, but the indent they'd left in the sofa remained. This repeated itself all night. Each time I felt close to drifting off, those impossibly long fingers would reach out of the darkness somewhere and make an appearance. They knocked glasses off countertops, opened the fridge, turned on the oven, and, whenever possible, they touched me. Stroked an ear, tickled my nose, slid between my fingers and tried to hold my hand. I tried to play chicken with it at one point. I stayed stock still as a greasy finger plucked at my lips and tried to find its way into my mouth, but before it met any success I flipped out and ran shrieking into the corridor outside my apartment. Panting in the hallway, I told myself I'd never step foot in that apartment, but there was something about the way all my neighbors came to their doors one by one and just stared at me in my underwear and sweat-stained vest. I felt like a fucking idiot, and before I knew it, I was offering muddled apologies while slinking through my front door. By the time I got to school the next day, I felt like I was teetering on the edge of a breakdown. I genuinely suspected my day was going to end with me being carted off in a straitjacket. Last people I expected to find any understanding from were my students, but when I came in looking like a sleep-deprived drunk, they all stared at me in silence. And this wasn't the slack-jawed idiocy I'm sometimes used to with these kids, like that time I told them I used to have a wife. This was something else. Took me a second to decipher it. Not the sort of expression I'm used to from kids in that age group, what with half of them being miniature psychopaths. It was sympathy. They felt sorry for me. But when I took a step forward, every single one of them scooted their chairs backward. Just like that, it clicked. I'd spent the last year watching them take turns ostracizing one another, and I'd written it off as just a peculiar product of childhood social dynamics. It felt cruel, and I'd tried over and over to mitigate it. To sit with the excluded kids and talk with them, try to figure it all out. But it was an enigma, all of it. If it wasn't for the fact that this fucked up system seemed to operate on some kind of rota, I would have been forced to intervene. But as it was, the kid who was targeted would always be back with the crowd a week later, and they'd be the ones excluding someone else. But now all of that made sense. The way they were looking at me. Pity. Recognition. They knew what I'd spent the night going through, and for the last year they'd gone through it themselves one by one. "You should play with Grenwig, sir," one of the quieter girls piped up, looking wide-eyed like a hostage at gunpoint, and all the other kids nodded. "Yeah, he wants to play. You need to play with him. He gets real impatient." A chorus of whispered ahs. "Grenwig?" I muttered. "One word. Is that what it's called?" I wondered, and all the kids nodded like they could read my mind. There are no records of Grenwig anywhere, by the way. Good God, I tried 1,000 times over to find something, anything. The best I could think of was that Grenwig was a kind of boogeyman, but what does that even mean? Just a word I used to give the world a little more shape. A little more structure. I'm not sure Grenwig has much of either. The games he plays are like what a toddler or a young dog would be interested in. Basic stuff. No rules. I move something. Grenwig moves it back. Hours lost tracing the spiral of my hair, or pulling at my cheeks and face to create strange new expressions, or flicking the lights on and off. During that week I took to eating lunch in my car, largely because it was hard to be around people who couldn't see why a glass went flying at the wall, or why I had to keep stacking plates until they were so tall they toppled over. At least the kids gave me a heads up. Most important warning I ever got in my life. Every kid had their own observations, some more reliable than others. Most of them boiled down to the simple fact that for 7 days you belonged to Grenwig. You were a toy. A source of endless amusement for something that had the sense of humor of a 3-year-old. Pretty much every kid agreed on one concrete thing though. Saying no to Grenwig was dangerous. Now I can't say for sure, but I'm positive Grenwood gave the kids more leeway. He left them alone for lunch and dinner. Bedtime games were usually quieter. But for me it was almost like part of the game was watching me go about my adult life, as he did everything to fuck with me. He'd snatch at my steering wheel, giggling from the dark footwell, yellow eyes peering up from between my legs. He'd grab my phone and throw it into the middle of traffic. Or sit there tickling my neck and armpits as the principal demanded to know why my class's behavior was so erratic. He made it difficult. Pushed me right up to breaking point. Eventually I did snap. I slapped his hand away as he tried to mess with me during a traffic stop. Felt like screaming at him that he was this close to getting me shot, but of course I couldn't. Just had to sit there as this cop looked over my license and mulled giving me a sobriety test. Couldn't blame him. I'd been swerving all over the road until I saw the flashing lights. Didn't help when, as he approached my pulled over car, he saw me slapping furiously at the steering wheel while hissing, "Stop it," over and over. He inevitably issued the test, which I passed. The cop gave me a long narrow-eyed stare before telling me to get some sleep. He must have figured I was just a stressed mental case instead of a drunk. And he was right. It was day 6 and I barely slept. Despite all the grave warnings from the kids about the dangers of telling Grenwood off, I drove off hoping that maybe he would just let this one go. I went to school and taught lessons as usual, but Grenwood made no appearances. I asked the kids if his little Rhoda ever found itself wrapping up a day early, and they all shook their heads like they knew bad news was coming my way, but none of them wanted to say for sure. Still, it was my first time, so I ignored the look in their eyes and tried my best to focus on the hope that maybe Grenwood was going to finally leave me alone. A feeling that dissolved in its entirety when I opened my front door and found a package on the floor. A large box, about 1 foot cubed. It looked like old cardboard, like what happens when it gets soaked but left out to dry. Just dingy. Its sides had been stapled together too, and that gave it a real homemade look that went the extra creepy little mile. I expected something bad. I knew the second when I went to lift it, and it was too heavy that something was wrong. It just felt, well, it felt like lifting an overfull bucket from the bottom. And then there was the smell, and the noises that sounded like a distant transmission of a mewing child. Tinny, like the muffled cries of someone on the other side of a very thick wall. When I finally opened it, I found the policeman inside, familiar because of the shield and name. He'd been folded, I guess is the best way I can describe it. At first I thought it was just his uniform, but, well, clothes aren't warm, and obviously a folded uniform wouldn't explain the forearm hair and skin poking out the side. I recoiled, terrified. Fell backwards onto my ass, and this was when Grenwood made an appearance. His arachnid fingers curled out of the box. I'd say about a dozen of them this time, but there are always more in the dark. Out of sight. And these did what I couldn't have brought myself to do on my own. They unfolded the policeman, lifted him up like a tailor showing off a suit, and the flayed skin opened up to reveal the barely recognizable outline of an adult man. He was still alive. And the rest of him, I soon found out, was in my bathtub. And that half was also very much alive. Thrashing and sliding as it struggled to gain a grip on the smooth ceramics, begging for its other half. Words I don't really think were a natural fit for the stern man who'd interrogated me just 10 hours ago. But then again, it wasn't really the same man. Either way, he spoke of the darkness between atoms, the infinite space where time doesn't exist, and the endless shapes that swim the murky abyss, fleeing their cruel god. More than that, he lamented no longer being whole. Feeling himself in 2 places at once. He called it wrong, and on that he had my agreement. I begged Grenwood to take it away. To undo what he had done. And that was how I used my first favor. The box and the man disappeared, dragged off to some dark corner that was out of sight. And that was the last I saw of him, although a bit of research later on revealed that while Grenwood did indeed put him back together, the poor man has been catatonic in a hospital bed ever since. Alive, but definitely not well. Next day the kids asked me what I'd requested. I told them I asked for a new PlayStation. didn't tell them the truth, partly because it had traumatized them, but partly because acknowledging it even happened would traumatize me. After that I crunched the numbers. I figured out the number of kids and how often the rota would fall on me. Based on this info, I booked the week off work ahead of time and well, I just waited. I tried to support the kids as best I could when it was their turn, but they didn't really have the same problems as me. I mean, it wasn't a holiday for them either. Each one came to school looking like they'd spent the night watching their dog die over and over. Just distraught. Ruined. Exhausted. But like I said, Grenwood generally let them eat their food, or interact with their parents and siblings without demanding attention at the worst possible time. Eventually round 2 came along. The kids seemed damned relieved. As for Grenwood's games, this time I came prepared. I'd already noticed that Grenwood only ever emerged from the shadows, and the kids corroborated that fact. So in the run-up to my turn I spent a few weeks setting my bathroom up with as many lamps and torches as I could find. Wasn't easy to eliminate all those shadows. I had a lot of sleepless nights trialing different arrangements, but eventually I got one as close to perfect as I could. I figured if I could have just 1 or 2 nights of sleep it'd be damned easier to deal with him. An hour passed before my stomach started to ache. By the time I realized what Grenwood was doing I could already feel the urge to throw up. Guess I hadn't given him much of a choice. He wanted to play, and there was only one place in that room that was still dark. Wasn't until I threw myself out into my living room and switched off all the lights that the pain eased up, but by then I was already close to suffocating on the finger sticking out of my throat. When it finally withdrew and I took my first breath in over a minute, I collapsed to the floor, unable to do much of anything except heave and sob. Grenwood, yellow eyes glaring at me from the space beneath my sofa, giggled. In hindsight, I'm lucky he found it funny. I think he thought it was a game of sorts. God knows what would have happened if that little stunt had made him mad. Otherwise, that second round passed without incident. At least, I wasn't at work. It was hell, but I didn't have to worry about driving anywhere or being out in public waiting for those wretched hands to find me. I just stayed indoors and played his weird little games, which mainly just involved me cleaning up whatever stupid thing he decided to make a mess of. I found it helped if I played up my exasperation. The less I reacted to his mischief, the more likely he'd escalate. When it was all over I asked for a winning lottery ticket. Unfortunately, I didn't specify the amount, which I supposed is my fault. At least the amount I won covered rent that month, even if my expectations were a little higher. Still, I figured it'd be better next time. I'd be more specific, I decided. Best laid plans of mice and men. You ever lost someone? Most people have. I have, for sure. More than once, too. It nearly unmade me and I was a fully grown man. It was about a couple days before my turn that Alia experienced her first loss. Most kids it's a hamster. If they're unlucky, a grandparent. For her, it was her older brother. I'd taught him 11 years earlier and he was a good kid. Smart, like her. Went on to become a mechanic. His passing wasn't anything strange or sinister. Just an accident. Jack popped off. Car crushed him. Random. Devastating. She was called out of a lesson by the principal and her parents, the 3 of them looking like hell. Like they'd spent a month one-on-one with Grenwood. A little reminder that not all nightmares hide in the dark, I suppose. An hour passed before my stomach started to ache. By the time I realized what Grenwood was doing I could already feel the urge to throw up. Guess I hadn't given him much of a choice. He wanted to play, and there was only one place in that room that was still dark. Wasn't until I threw myself out into my living room and switched off all the lights that the pain eased up, but by then I was already close to suffocating on the finger sticking out of my throat. When it finally withdrew and I took my first breath in over a minute, I collapsed to the floor, unable to do much of anything except heave and sob. Grenwood, yellow eyes glaring at me from the space beneath my sofa, giggled. In hindsight, I'm lucky he found it funny. I think he thought it was a game of sorts. God knows what would have happened if that little stunt had made him mad. Otherwise, that second round passed without incident. At least, I wasn't at work. It was hell, but I didn't have to worry about driving anywhere or being out in public waiting for those wretched hands to find me. I just stayed indoors and played his weird little games, which mainly just involved me cleaning up whatever stupid thing he decided to make a mess of. I found it helped if I played up my exasperation. The less I reacted to his mischief, the more likely he'd escalate. When it was all over, I asked for a winning lottery ticket. Unfortunately, I didn't specify the amount, which I supposed is my fault. At least the amount I won covered rent that month, even if my expectations were a little higher. Still, I figured it'd be better next time. I'd be more specific, I decided. Best laid plans of mice and men. You ever lost someone? Most people have. I have, for sure. More than once, too. It nearly unmade me, and I was a fully grown man. It was about a couple days before my turn that Alia experienced her first loss. Most kids, it's a hamster. If they're unlucky, a grandparent. For her, it was her older brother. I'd taught him 11 years earlier, and he was a good kid. Smart, like her. Went on to become a mechanic. His passing wasn't anything strange or sinister. Just an accident. Jack popped off. Car crushed him. Random. Devastating. She was called out of a lesson by the principal and her parents, the three of them looking like hell. Like they'd spent a month one-on-one with Grenwig. A little reminder that not all nightmares hide in the dark, I suppose. I don't know why this hit me hard. I think it was probably my own experience with grief. Either way, it stuck with me. Her absence, the empty chair and desk, felt hard to ignore day after day, knowing what she was going through. I think it's one thing to accept that these kids will face circumstance. Poverty. Shit parents. Life isn't fair. I don't get a say in the way society says some kids get ponies and others get rickets. But there's something about losing someone that way, just a random confluence of bad luck, that hits harder than most. I don't know if I can explain it. It's just Alia was already growing up at the bottom rung of our not very invisible class system. Hadn't she had her fair share of bad luck already? I mean, fuck, even Grenwig grants favors. Even that wretched monster isn't all bad. But an accident like what happened to Alia's brother, there's no upside. It's just shit. Even broken, his strength was something special. Trapped in a bear hug, slowly being pulled towards that abyssal shadow, I began to panic. But it was far too little, and far too late. I went feet first. A feeling like nothing else I'd ever had. In the end, I was clinging by the tips of my fingers to an impossible ledge. Above me was a sort of opening with no defined beginning or end, and on the other side lay my living room. I looked down and, for the first time, saw Grenwig as a whole. In hindsight, it had been a mistake to think of him as humanoid. I think I'd just decided the boogeyman should look like a man, but what floated in the strange ether beneath me was more akin to a jellyfish, or maybe a spider. I don't know. It was dark in that void, and yet impossible clear. I could see things in there. More than just Grenwig. It defied dimensions as we understand it. It was both an ocean and a landscape. In the distance, leviathans swam through open space. I'm not even sure I was seeing based on light. When I blinked, I still saw everything. Grenwig found it all hilarious. He had a mouth, and it laughed maniacally as it peeled Alia's brother from around my waist, leaving me free to kick and pull my way back into reality. As I slid onto the carpet of my living room, his laughter persisted. As soon as I was out, I crawled and rushed to the bathroom where I locked the door and passed out. Grenwig's next turn with me lasted 2 weeks, which I think was because I made 2 requests. One for Alia's brother to return from the dead, and the other for him to be taken away. Either way, I didn't begrudge Grenwig's games. But it did mean I didn't get another request. I have to wait until next time. Meanwhile, I've watched the children approach the end of the school year, and I find myself wondering if they'll age out of Grenwig or take him with them into the next teacher's class. If he leaves them alone, will he terrorize the next lot of kids I teach? Either way, I think Grenwood will let me double up again, and that's important because if so, I know what I'm going to do. Like I said before, I'm out of here. No more teaching. I'm cashing out. But I've decided, after what I did to Alia and her brother, that I can at least take Grenwood with me. He can become a permanent friend, leave the kids the hell alone. I don't want him following them, or haunting the next bunch to come along. I'm going to stuff my pockets so full of cash that I can build him and me a playground, and he won't ever have to bother them again. They have enough to deal with. Story 2. I attended my high school's 10-year reunion. There's something terribly wrong with the rest of my graduating class. There's a saying in my hometown, nobody leaves Copper Hill for good. For years, I'd mostly managed to defy it. In the decade that followed my graduation from Copper Hill High School, I hardly set foot in its vicinity. Instead, I absorbed myself in my studies at an out-of-state university and, eventually, my career. I spent the little free time I had with my girlfriend, who I'd met as a sophomore in a chemistry lab, and her friends. When we eventually broke up, I lost not only her, but also what little social life I had. It was in this state of loneliness that I found a letter from my old high school in the mail. This surprised me, as I hadn't realized that anyone there even knew my current mailing address. I opened the envelope to find an invitation inside. Its design was fancier than I'd expected, complete with gold-colored glitter, a royal blue background, and a finely drawn silver border. It read, in cursive letters, "Cheers for 10 years. Zachary R. _____. Please join us for the CHHS class of 2013 official reunion." It went on to list the start time and the school's address. On its back, it even contained a personalized handwritten note. "I know you live far away, Zach, but it would mean so much to me if you can make the trip. Paul and I will be there, and Arthur may fly in as well. I'd love to catch up. Hope to see you soon. Vince K _____, co-chair, CHHS Reunion Planning Committee." Vince had been one of my best friends, once. You see, Copper Hill is one of those rare small towns where you can easily graduate from high school alongside the same friends you first made in kindergarten. In my case, my buddies Arthur, Paul, and Vince. I'd spent most of my youth with them. The four of us were in the same scout troop, played on the same sports teams, and took mostly the same classes. On weekends, and on weeknights, when we felt like sneaking out without permission, we often stayed up late together playing video games and drinking whatever cheap beer we managed to keep hidden from our parents. We'd meant so much to each other once. So why, since graduation, had I neglected them so badly? I couldn't even remember the last time I'd talked to any of them. Perhaps this reunion could serve as an opportunity for me to reignite friendships I'd let fade. At a minimum, I knew that spending time, even just one evening, with my old pals would do me a lot of good, especially considering how lonely I'd been lately. Accordingly, I resolved to attend. By the time I reached Copper Hill, I was an hour behind schedule due to congestion caused by an accident. As I approached town, I observed amidst the fading evening light that it appeared even quieter and more deserted than I remembered. Bars that had reliably drawn decent crowds on a Friday night ranged from boarded up to barely occupied. Meanwhile, the few other cars on the street drove lethargically at speeds far below the limit, and I spotted no pedestrians. In my memory, the school was only a short distance from the courthouse, city hall, and post office that formed most of downtown, but my GPS took me down a long, unfamiliar route bordered on both sides by tall cornfields. I was about to pull over and double-check the address I'd entered when, sure enough, my headlights illuminated a sign in the school's distinct black and red colors that stated, CHHS, Home of the Patriots. The brick building that loomed behind it was just as I remembered, from its tall, towering middle section to the two narrower wings that stretched out to the left and right. Through the rectangular windows that lined the main building, I made out indistinct, shadowy figures milling about inside. A banner displaying "Welcome, 10 years, CHHS Reunion" stretched over the stairs that led to the main entrance. Underneath it, a familiar figure scurried towards the main entrance. "Arthur," I said to myself with a smile. Seeing Arthur improved my mood. He was the only other member of our class to leave town after graduation, and I suspected that he might share somewhat of an outsider status with me. It'll be just like old times, I reassured myself as I approached the building. Strangely, though, it still didn't feel that way. For one, the air had a staleness to it that was difficult to describe. It felt artificial and thin such that, as I climbed the front steps, I found myself needing to breathe in more of it than usual to avoid getting winded. Plus, the school's location still seemed off somehow. It didn't make any sense. It's not like a building this large could have been relocated. But, amidst the eerily quiet surrounding countryside, everything felt more isolated and remote than I remembered it being. I tried to stop worrying. After all, with any luck, I'd soon be laughing and reminiscing with old friends who'd be happy to see me. Inside, balloon garlands, multicolored streamers, triangle flags, and small banners welcoming attendees decorated the main corridor. I observed tables stocked with snacks, pamphlets, and information about fundraisers. The only noise came from the intercom, which played an era-appropriate Calvin Harris song. Everything necessary for a reunion was there, with only one notable exception: the people. As I approached an unmanned table marked check-in, I wondered where everybody had gone. Perhaps the event had moved to a different room? I was late, after all. As I added my signature to a sign-in sheet, my eyes scanned the list of other attendees who were marked as having already arrived. I recognized many names on it. Like Alice, who'd shared a stand with me in orchestra. Our conductor was a hard-ass, a real disciplinarian who snapped at us constantly, and Alice was one of the many students he'd driven to tears on a semi-regular basis. I'd had this petty fantasy of comforting her after class, and then mustering the courage to ask her out. But I never did it. It was Vince, actually, who'd ended up with her. That had always annoyed me. I'd confided in Vince about how I felt about Alice and, soon after, the two of them were together. It felt as frustrating as it sounds. But, oh well, that's what I get for hesitating for as long as I did. Drifting down the hallway, my eyes caught the words reception displayed over double doors that led to the gymnasium. It made sense as the main location for the event. That's where homecoming, prom, and plenty of major sports events were held, after all. I could hear chatter, laughter, and the loud thump of dance music just beyond the gym doors. I approached it excitedly. But, when I stepped inside, all the noise instantly cut out, leaving me in an eerie silence. Even more perplexingly, the room before me, like the entrance corridor, was entirely devoid of people. A party had just been here, no doubt. I spotted a makeshift bar stocked with a standard assortment of liquor, tables holding half-finished drinks and refreshments, and an area cleared for a dance floor in the room's center, but there were no people around. Had I missed everyone again? Where had they gone? Hello? I called out, to no avail, as I drifted around the room in a state of bewilderment. As I did so, I came across the entrance to the boys' locker room. Just a whiff of the musty, sweaty smell emanating from it unlocked long-buried memories of the time I'd spent in there. I remembered one occasion, in particular, where Paul had gotten pissed at me. Paul was usually a pretty low-key guy, but when he lost it, he went wild. On that particular occasion, he'd been angry with me, hadn't he? But why? I recalled his hot breath as he got in my face and screamed at me. When I gently nudged him away, he responded by slamming a locker door into my head. My memories from that moment forward were hazy. There was a growing pool of blood, the pain of his fist against my cheek, and the cheering of the classmates who had encircled us. They were egging us on to continue the fight, as if my beating could be called that. I hadn't thought about this event in years. How could I have forgotten something like that? My mind churned in confusion. Feeling dizzy, I took a seat on a bench that appeared to be part of a crude photo booth setup as my mind continued to replay this repressed memory. As Paul had continued to pummel me, I'd spotted Vince among the gathered crowd. I'd begged for him to intervene. But neither he, nor our strangely absent instructor, had done anything to help me. It was only when Arthur got between us that Paul had reluctantly cooled off. It had taken weeks for those bruises to heal. Had Paul ever been punished for it, or even apologized? Surely he must have. We'd remain friends, after all. A strange pressure around my shoulder and a sudden bright light jolted me back to the present. The flash on the camera facing the bench I was sitting on had gone off, somehow, even with nobody around to operate it. How was that possible? Maybe it was automated to go off every so often? It didn't make sense, just like so much else that was happening. Where was everybody, and whose voices had I been hearing? I'd seen people from the road, and I'd even watched Arthur come inside, but, as far as I could tell, the event was deserted. I texted Arthur asking if he'd found anyone. For all I knew, he could have changed his number in the many years that had gone by since I'd last used it, but I figured it was worth a shot. To my relief, he responded right away. "Hey man, long time no see. Paul just called me. He says everyone's up on the 3rd floor, in Mr. Manelli's old room. I'm on my way there now. Meet you there soon." I couldn't fathom why the entire event would relocate from the area clearly designated for it to the 3rd floor. There wasn't much up there, after all, aside from classrooms and a few administrative officers. Nonetheless, I resolved to head up there. Arthur was there, after all, and hopefully the rest of my friends would be as well. Navigating off my memory of the building's layout, I hopped up a small set of steps that connected the gym to the 2nd floor. From there, it would just be a short walk past a few classrooms before I'd arrive at the central staircase, which would take me to my destination. I'd never seen the school quite this gloomy before. Each footstep echoed through the halls. The classrooms were weirdly empty, too, bereft of any decorations or other signs of use. I recognized one as my calculus classroom. I remembered how, after class had ended one day, I'd come across a group of students congregating in the hallway. Mary, Michelle, and Abby, like so many of my classmates, had grown up with me, and I'd always gotten along with them. But that day, they were harassing a shy girl, Morgan, I think. Calling her all sorts of names, slut, whore, bitch. She was trying to get away from them, but they wouldn't let her leave. Their taunting of her became a regular thing, and it often left Morgan in tears. Whatever happened to Morgan? Like most of my friends, I'd known her since I was a little kid. She was quiet, but she was perfectly nice. Then, one day, gossip about her started to spread. The type of nasty, embellished rumors that often make their way through high schools, full of sexist undertones and double standards. Her former friends shunned her, and she'd been subjected to taunting and ridicule as she walked to class and sat alone at lunch. And, one day, she was just gone. I'd always assumed that her family had moved away, but was that true? Growing up, Mary, Michelle, and Abby had always been sweet girls. I'd never seen them treat another person the way they'd treated Morgan. But Copper Hill High School had a way of bringing out the worst in people. There was just something about this building, this place, that ate away at our souls. Had I bullied Morgan, too? Maybe not, but once her mistreatment started, it's not like I'd made an effort to be kind to her, or ever invited her to sit with me and my friends in the cafeteria. I could have done more. I reached the central staircase. With each step that I took up towards the 3rd floor, a feeling of dread ran through me. I'd seen something terrible happen up here, hadn't I? It was Paul and Vince. Arthur had done something to offend them. It could have been the rumors spreading about his reasons for never having a girlfriend, his diminutive size, or the way he'd reacted when Paul had beaten me half to death. Whatever the reason, Paul and Vince, without my knowledge, had decided to subject Arthur to a cruel prank. After school one day, they'd lured Arthur up to the 3rd floor, where they'd taken hold of him and tried to wedge him into his own locker. Now, there's a reason this sort of thing occurs primarily on 90s sitcoms. Most people simply can't fit inside of a locker. Arthur, as short and skinny as he was, turned out to be no exception, but this only made things worse for him. As Arthur later related to me, Paul and Vince laughed rowdily as they slammed him repeatedly into the metal frame. By the time they finally relented, Arthur had bruises all over his body. There were other horrible acts, too. Other victims, other beatings. It dawned on me that this place had been an absolute hellhole. It's no wonder I, and Arthur, too, had gotten as far away from it as we could at the first opportunity. The peculiar thing was that, in the years that had passed, I'd somehow forgotten all of this until just now. Instead, my recollections of high school were all happy, all positive. Had false memories of camaraderie and friendship drawn Arthur back as well? Finally, I reached the third level. The overhead fluorescent light fixtures flickered sporadically, revealing, in brief spurts, dilapidated lockers, litter, and layers of dust and dirt that coated the floor. I approached Mr. Manelli's classroom. Through the shaded hallway window, I could discern the outlines of roughly a dozen figures inside. I heard a voice, too. It was muffled and indistinct, but I could tell that the speaker was giving some kind of speech. She stopped, and a loud round of applause followed. I reached for the door handle, unsure of what to expect. Hopefully, it would just be the people I'd driven 4 hours to see. But, after the events thus far, I half expected the room to be empty. If so, I was jumping ship and going home. To my surprise, just before I made contact with it, the door slowly opened on its own. The brightly lit room before me was filled not with people, at least in the general understanding of the word. Rather, the still, bony forms before me resembled the kind of props a biology teacher might use to teach human anatomy. The skeletons that stood silently throughout the room, that stood posed with drinks, that sat at desks, and that had assembled around a speaker had to be props, right? Even though Mr. Manelli was a history teacher, my mind searched desperately for some kind of explanation. This had to be an elaborate prank, right? Had Vince and Paul lured me, and maybe Arthur, too, out here just to freak us the fuck out? I wouldn't put it past them. It's precisely the kind of thing they'd do, even if the whole setup, complete with an array of prop skeletons, was a bit extreme. But, then, who was making all the noises I'd been hearing? Was that part of the prank, too? Fuck it, I thought. If this was a big gag at my expense, then I'd just have to deal with the embarrassment later. I was getting out of there. Zach, called a strained voice in the hallway. If this a joke, then it's not Dash. The voice interrupted me. Zach, help me, please. It was Arthur's voice, and it was coming from the hallway nearby. He sounded like he was in serious trouble, so I hurried after him. Eventually, I found myself in a corner of the hallway, one where, if I remembered correctly, he and I used to have lockers. But, once again, I found myself alone. I yelled out his name several times. Arthur. Arthur. It was no use. I appeared to be at a dead end. That's when the locker next to me shook. I jumped back, surprised. It was shut, but not locked. I gripped the handle and pulled it open. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw inside. It was Arthur's torso. The rest of his body was gone, and something was dragging what was left of him further away, further back into a dark abyss where the wall should have been. Blood gurgled out of his mouth as he gasped my name one last time. He reached out a red-stained hand. Hoping to somehow pull him out, I tried to take it, only for whatever unseen force had taken hold of him to pull him away, leaving behind a wide hole in the back of the locker. More blood gushed through it, leaking onto the hallway floor. So glad you could make it, said a monotone voice behind me. I whirled around to see two fleshy arms emerge from another locker across from me. The skinless figure left wet, red stains on the white surface as she got to her feet and stepped towards me. Don't you recognize your old crush? Surely 10 years haven't been that rough on me. Alice? I stuttered, stepping backwards. Lockers all around me started opening, each accompanied by a new pair of bloody arms of figures that slowly crawled outwards. My survival instincts kicked in. I sprinted away, my legs frantically carrying me towards the main staircase. All around me, figures emerged, reaching out to me as I passed by. Through an open door, I noticed that another classroom was filled with skeletons, just as Mr. Manelli's had been. When I reached the main staircase, it was guarded by a tall, fleshy figure. "Don't you want to be with us?" it asked in a familiar, deep voice that I knew to be Paul's. "We can be complete. A full class. All of us, together again." Like old times. He lurched for me. Just barely. I managed to dodge him, but I lost balance in the process. Before I knew it, I was tumbling down the stairs. Pain shot through me as I collided with step after step. Finally, I landed on a level surface. Dizzily, I climbed to my feet and did my best to ignore the soreness that spread throughout my body. A quick glance upwards confirmed that the bloody figures, the ones that somehow resembled my old classmates, were, indeed, heading towards me. Meanwhile, the temperature inside was rising noticeably, and the walls around me were steadily changing in color from a dull gray to a deep red. As I scrambled down the rest of the stairs and across the main corridor on the first floor, an intense tremor ran through the building, sending me sprawling to the ground. Despite a sharp pain that spread through my ankle, I hobbled as quickly as I could to the exit. I didn't look back as I made my way across the parking lot to my car. I started the ignition, backed out, and headed towards the long road I'd used to get there. In my rearview mirror, I chanced a glance back at the school. It was shaking violently, like it was being struck by an earthquake. My car lurched in different directions as the ground underneath me also started to rumble. In an effort to avoid my car being sent off the road and into the neighboring fields, I frantically steered it to the center, between the lanes heading into and out of town. When I looked back again, the school was, somehow, even closer to me than it had been before. How was that possible? Was it following me? I floored the accelerator. Row after row of cornfield flew by me as I drove at the fastest speed of my life. I was on the edge of town, close to the nearest interstate ramp, when local police pulled me over. As the officer approached me, I stared into the rearview mirror. At the first glimpse of whatever it was that had chased after me, I'd hit the road again, law enforcement be damned. In truth, I hadn't seen my pursuer since I'd exited the cornfield a few minutes ago, but I hardly felt safe. "Clocked you going nearly 100, son," said the officer. I stayed silent. My baffled self was unsure of how to best handle the situation. The officer gave me a quizzical look as he examined my ID and registration. "You're Don and Fran's son, aren't you? The one who left town?" I nodded. "Why'd you come back?" "There was, a 10-year reunion. For my graduating class." He shook his head. "I doubt that." He looked down, then at my perplexed face. "Where, exactly, was this reunion?" "At the school," I said. I struggled to understand his reaction. What about my story didn't make sense? And, regardless, was I about to be booked for driving 50 miles over the speed limit? Is that something they throw you in jail for? "Wait here," barked the officer. He went to his car where he proceeded to have a long conversation over his radio. After a few minutes, he returned to me. "Get out of here, son. Leave, and don't come back. Don't do something like this again. You hear me?" Yeah, that's fine," I said, astonished. "Then scram," he ordered. I obliged and began the long journey home. I had no idea what to make of what occurred. I can hardly find anything at all online about Copper Hill High, or any of my classmates who went there, and I'm not exactly eager to reach out to any of them. I can't make much sense of what happened, but I am sure of one thing, that I barely made it out of that situation, and that I shouldn't press my luck much further. My ankle needs some more time to heal. Once it does, I'm going to try joining a social club and making new friends. After what happened to me in Copper Hill, I decided that the past is not a place where I need to dwell any longer. 2 weeks have passed since the reunion. Today, an envelope with no return address arrived with my mail. It contained a single photograph on glossy paper with a short note written underneath. The image featured me on the bench in the photo booth. Sitting to my side, with his arm over my shoulders, was Vince. He wore a blue-collared shirt and looked normal. No missing skin, no bloody imprints on the surface around him. Paul crouched behind us, a dopey grin on his face. He, too, looked just as I'd imagined he would in his late 20s. To Paul's right, Abby, Morgan, and Michelle posed together with their arms around each other. It was a perfectly ordinary image, the exact kind of photo you'd expect to be taken at an event like that. The handwritten caption underneath read, "Although your visit was briefer than we preferred, we all had a splendid time catching up with you, Zach. Please feel free to come by anytime. Nobody truly leaves Copper Hill, after all. Vince K _____, co-chair, CHHS Reunion Planning Committee." P.S. The note continued, "We are delighted that Arthur has finally joined us. Maybe you will, too, at our 20th. The writing up to this point was cursive font in traditional black ink. The last few words, however, were larger in size, messily scrawled, and colored a deep shade of red. "See you then, buddy, if not sooner." Story 3. My sociology class. Alright, so this actually happened on November 5th, but I didn't think about writing it for you guys until now. I am a university freshman, and I have a sociology lecture every Wednesday night from 6:30 to 9 o'clock. The professor is pretty cool, and I actually don't mind the course despite being a finance major. Anyways, last Wednesday was the date for the midterm 2 exam. We were given 4 questions in advance and were told that 2 of these questions would be asked on our exam, where we would be required to write an essay for each question in a 50-minute span. This was midterm 2, so I already kind of knew what to expect. Anyways, I'm digressing from the whole reason I am writing this. The lecture was to start with a normal lecture, and then for the last 50 minutes we would write the exam. During the lecture portion of the section, I was sitting on the far right of the hall, and spent some time looking around my lecture hall at all of the other zombie stressed out students and wondering how they were going to do in the exam. There has got to be around 200 students in this class, so it's not uncommon to see someone who you'd never seen before. But this time, as I was looking around the class, I caught sight of someone on the other side of the hall. The first thing that caught my eye was the red hoodie she was wearing. I have one literally exactly like it, and she had her hair in a ponytail exactly the way my girlfriend does it. The weirder part was that her face really resembled my girlfriend. I had to do a double take to make sure it actually wasn't my girlfriend wearing my hoodie. As soon as I had looked at her, her head swiveled in my direction, and I saw the familiar face of my girlfriend. Only not quite. Her eyes were definitely not the same, in fact they seemed sunken, hollowed. Her mouth hung open, as though she were yawning, only she never closed it. I quickly looked away, as you would when someone catches you looking at them. It sure was odd though, seeing someone who so closely resembles your girlfriend. Anyways, a little while later I take a peek again in her direction to try and discern the differences between her and my girlfriend. Instantly, her head swiveled to meet my gaze, and her gaping mouth and sunken eyes startled me. I'm going to be honest now. I had actually come to the conclusion that she had some sort of mental disorder. Normal people don't leave their mouth open like that. I turned away and decided not to look over there again. Lecture continued. We had a 10-minute break to prepare for the exam. I looked back at the girl in the red hoodie, but didn't see her in her seat. Oh well. I read through my notes and prepared myself for the exam. About a minute before the exam started, the girl came back, but entered through the right-hand auditorium door. She descended the stairs and sat right next to me. Right next to me. I could literally feel those hollow eyes piercing me, and from my peripheral vision, I could make out the gaping maw. She tapped me on the shoulder, and I turned to her. Her eyes pierced right through me. I've never had an experience like that, and I can tell you it wasn't enjoyable at all. And that mouth. It seemed dark. I mean, I know everyone's mouth is a dark place, but hers just seemed more dark. She stared straight into my eyes and whispered, without closing her mouth or moving her lips, "I'd like a pencil." Have you ever seen someone speak without moving their lips or closing their mouth? It has got to be one of the single most terrifying things I have ever seen/heard. It was almost as though there was something else within her, something inside her throat, speaking for her. I nodded, gave her a pencil, and didn't look at her for the rest of the exam. When I was finished, I squeezed past her to hand my paper in. While doing so, I glanced down at her sitting form. Her exam paper was blank, and as my eyes traveled from her paper to her face, I realized that although her head was still turned to the exam paper, her eyes had been fixated on my body the entire time. That was it for me. I handed my paper in, and speed walked out of the lecture hall, making sure not to look behind me. I had a thought that she might follow me out, but when I looked back a ways away from the hall, she was nowhere in sight. My next class is next Wednesday. I really hope she isn't there.